The old Frisco depot agent at West Plains, Missouri, in the third week of March 1938, told anyone who asked him, and Doshia Fur asked him, on the porch outside his boarding house, on a cool morning with a light rain on the shingles, that the Vardy Grand Circus train had gone over the Elwood Trestle in the November of 1868, and that anything worth finding had been picked over 60 years back, and there was no cause to go looking. Doshia Fur was 23 that spring. She had not asked the agent for advice. She had asked him for a route. She had lost her father to the railroad at 14 and her father's small pension, and the deeded 3 acres to her stepfather at 23. And she had spent 2 years reading her father's spike-gauge ledgers, and she had come out to West Plains with a brass switch key in her belt and a small brindle dog named Whistle at her heel, because the Vardy train, in her father's judgment and hers, had not been picked over. It had been walked by, over and over, by folks who did not know how to see it. She meant to see it. If a story about a woman who trusted her father's ledger against her own town's memory has ever meant something to you, take a second to hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. It helps us find the folks who need this kind of story most. Her name was Doshia Louise Fur, called by nobody Doshia except her father, who had insisted on the full name from the day she was born because his own father had wanted it. She was born in the wet spring of 1914 in a small board and batten house on a lane above the tracks at West Plains, in Howell County, Missouri. In a corner of the Ozarks, the railroad had settled, and the timber companies had cut, and the cattle folks had come into after both. Her father was Coyle Fur, section hand for the St. Louis-San Francisco Railway, on the Willow Springs Division, a man who had spent his working life with a spike maul in his hand and a brass switch key in his belt. Her mother was Ollie Fur, who did piecework sewing for the Willow Springs seamstress, and who died of a bad heart in the winter of 1922, when Doshia was 7. Coyle raised Doshia after that with the help of a widowed neighbor named Mrs. Faro, who was Sicilian on her mother's side, and Calabrese on her father's, and who had come out to Howell County in the 90s, with a coal mining husband who had died in a St. Clair County collapse in 1901. Mrs. Faro cooked for Doshia and Coyle 3 days a week from the time Doshia was 7, and she called Doshia Piccolina, little one, in the Italian of her mother, from the very first evening, and she used the word every day of her life thereafter, was, from 7 on, a railroad child. Coyle took her out on his section hand rounds from the time she could walk the tracks, and by the time she was 10, she could set a rail with a spike maul, tighten a fishplate bolt, and read a rail bed for the small movement that meant a tie was going. By 14, she could read a train wreck. Coyle had been called out, in his 20-year career, to 9 wrecks on the Willow Springs Division, 3 of them serious, and he had, on every one, taken Doshia with him for the recovery work whenever school was out and the section boss would let him. He had taught her what a section hand knows about wrecked rolling stock. He had taught her that iron distributes in a wreck in patterns as a person can learn to read. A boiler blows one way, a passenger truck rolls another, a cage car. He had seen only one cage car in a wreck, but it had stayed with him. Breaks its barwork in a signature no other car breaks. He had taught her, above all, the brass switch key. The switch key was a small brass tool the section hand carried on his belt, a special key the length of his finger, cut to a Frisco pattern, that opened switch locks all along the line. It was, in the Frisco country, the tool that identified a railroad man. Coyle wore his on a leather thong at his belt, from the day he was hired at 17 until the day he died. He died at 41. On the 10th of December 1928, on a section between Willow Springs and Kabul, when a broken rail rolled a boxcar down the embankment onto the section crew, and Coyle was under it. Docia was 14. She was in the Willow Springs schoolhouse when the news came. She wore Coyle's brass switch key on her wrist to the funeral because there was no place else to put it, and she wore it every day of her life afterward. Coyle was buried in the West Plains Town Cemetery on a cold, clear morning of December in a plot beside Ollie. The Frisco paid Docia's mother's family a small death benefit and settled a modest pension on Docia herself to run to her majority, and left her with 3 deeded acres of the family lane, which was to be hers in fee at 21. Docia was raised, from 14 to 21, by Mrs. Farrow at the boarding house on Bear Street. She stayed in school. She read Coyle's ledgers in the evenings by lamp, a stack of 19 small, leather-covered notebooks in which Coyle had recorded every section job he had ever walked and every wreck he had ever recovered. She read them through twice. She had, before she was 18, developed a private acquaintance with a stretch of the old Elwood spur 4 miles west of Kabul, where, in the November of 1868, the Vardy Grand Circus train had gone off a wood trestle into a ravine so choked with second-growth timber that a Frisco survey party in 1902 had reported it impassable and of no interest. Her father had walked the ravine in 1918 in the company of an old Frisco trestle inspector named Kellen Stackhouse, and had made an entry in the 12th of his notebooks that Docia had, by the time she was 19, read 6 times. Her father's mother, Docia's grandmother, Verena Furr, who had lived out her days in a small house behind the Willow Springs depot, died in 1935 and had left, in her will, her small stack of household goods to Docia and her small piece of Ozark land to Coyle's brother, Reba Kern, who was Ollie's brother from her first marriage and Docia's step-uncle. Reba Kern owned a hardware store in West Plains. He was Docia's only living male kin, and he was, in the small formal sense that pensions and inheritances allow, her guardian in matters of paperwork from the time she was 14. He turned out, over the years, to be a poor guardian. He took, without her knowing, small shavings off the Frisco pension check that had been in his hands for signing. He took, when she was 21 and the 3 acres came clear, a mortgage on the 3 acres in his own name on the strength of a paper he had gotten her to sign at 17 for what he had said was a school tuition loan. He took, when she was 23 and confronted him about it, the position that the 3 acres were his under a foreclosure notice he had also arranged, and that Docia was welcome to leave the family lane or to marry the young Willow Springs bookkeeper he had picked for her. Docia did not marry the bookkeeper. She did not leave the lane peacefully either. She walked to Mrs. Farrow's on the day Reuel served her the notice. In the second week of March 1938, and Mrs. Farrow opened the door and looked at her once and said, "Piccolina, come in. The dog, too." Docia stayed. She wrote, that first evening at Mrs. Farrow's kitchen table, a letter to a lawyer in Springfield whom Kellen Stackhouse had named to her the summer before, and she started rereading her father's 12th notebook. She had known, since she was 19, what she was going to do if it ever came to this. She was going to walk the Elwood Ravine. She was going to find the Vardy train. Kellen Stackhouse was 71 that spring. He lived in a small, pale yellow house at Willow Springs, alone with a wire-hair terrier named Semaphore and a garden of tomatoes that came in late every year and always saved him in September. He had inspected trestles on the Frisco for 42 years and had known Coyle Furr since Coyle was 17. And he had walked the Elwood Ravine with Coyle in 1918 and had, on Coyle's death, sworn to look after Docia in whatever way an old man could look after a 14-year-old girl he saw once a month. He had looked after her the way old railroaders do, by teaching her what he knew when she came asking, and by staying out of the way when she did not. She had come asking in the summer of her 19th year, and Kellen had taken her out to the Elwood Ravine himself on a Sunday, and had walked her along the rim, and had said, "Doshia, iron remembers a wreck longer than a river remembers a bridge. What is down there still. Your father knew it. I know it. Someday you may find it a use." He had shown her, that afternoon, the small notch in the rim where he and Coyle had scrambled down in 1918. He had said, "Not now, when you have the time and the reason. Not now." She had not gone down. She had gone home. She went to see Kellen the second week of March, 1938, on the third evening after Reba Kern had served her the foreclosure notice. Kellen looked at her a long moment at his door and said, "You look like your father did the day he came in with his own foreclosure paper. Come in." She stayed 2 weeks. He taught her, over those 2 weeks, the finer grade of ravine work, how to rig a rope belay off a rim tree, how to test second-growth timber for stability, how to move slow through a ravine floor without disturbing what lay under the leaf mold, how to identify a rusted iron piece by its footprint in the leaf mold even if the piece itself had gone under a rotted trunk. He gave her, at the end of the 2 weeks, a folded strip of Frisco vellum on which he had, in 1918 with Coyle, drawn the layout of the wreck as best they had been able to see it. The boiler up at the north end, the passenger cars scattered, the cage cars in a heap at the south end, the small manager's office car, Kellen, and Coyle had been almost sure, further south still, pinned under a fallen oak. He said, "Doshia, if it is where we thought it was, the manager's car was the last one to go over and did not break up. What Vardy carried in his office car was not for the marks. It was his own. Whatever was in there, if the car is intact, is still there." She took the vellum. She put it in an oilskin. 2 West Plains skeptics she left behind that spring were her step-uncle Reba Kern, who told her at the courthouse door on the following Monday that she was making a fool of herself. In a ravine no railroad man had gone down in 20 years, and the wife of the Willow Springs bookkeeper, Reba, had picked for her, who told Doshia at Mrs. Farrow's kitchen door that Doshia would come to see reason if only she would spend a summer sitting still. Neither mattered. Her real trouble was Reba Kern's foreclosure paper itself, which the Springfield lawyer, a slow, careful young man named Wesley Ives, had by now identified as fraudulent. Doshia had been 17 at the signing, a minor, and the paper had not been countersigned by a guardian who had been notified of its purpose. But the fight would take months, and Doshia had, in that interval, no home and no money. She walked out to the Elwood Ravine on the third Monday of March with Kellen Stackhouse and a young rail walker named Emory Bledsoe, whom Kellen had recommended. They took 2 rope belays, a small folding spade, a hooded lantern, a small canvas sling for tools, a coil of hemp, 3 folding lanterns for the ravine floor, a small axe, and her father's brass switch key. Whistle rode on Kellen's saddle. They camped that night at the north rim of the ravine, in a stand of second-growth hickory that had grown up over the wreck line, and Kellen read her father's 12th notebook aloud to her by firelight, at Doshia's request, because the notebook was easier to hear in her father's voice, through Kellen's, than to read for herself in the smoke. "If you are new here, and this is finding you at a hard time, know that we make one of these every Friday, and every subscription helps the next person find their way. Thanks for being here." They lowered themselves into the ravine on the second morning. At the notch Kellen had shown her 19 years back, it was as she had remembered it. A shallow chute of leaf mold and mossy rock, with an old cedar at the rim that Kellen had used for his belay in 1918, and that still held. Emory belayed her down. Kellen belayed Emory. Whistle went down under her arm in a canvas sling. The ravine floor was quiet. It was quiet in a way she had not expected, a green underwater quiet, with the second-growth timber overhead thick enough to cut most of the sky, and the moss on the fallen trunks thick as a horse blanket. She stood a long moment at the bottom. She said, aloud, "I am here, Papa." Whistle came up out of the sling and shook himself and did not bark. They walked south along the ravine floor for 100 yards before she saw the first iron. It was a fireman's brass injector valve, half buried in moss, 20 yards off the ravine's center line. She marked it with a scrap of red ribbon. 10 paces further, a rusted crank arm from a steam gauge. 20 paces further, a mounded shape under the leaves that turned out, when she cleared it, to be a section of driver wheel with its rim still intact. She was walking the scatter of the Vardy locomotive. She knew because she was reading the pattern Coyle had taught her. The boiler at the north end of a wreck, the drivers scattered south of it, the cab further south still. She walked the scatter for the whole of the morning, marking. By noon she had mapped, in her father's 12th notebook, the full boiler and driver scatter of the wreck across 140 yards of ravine floor. By early afternoon, she had walked the scatter of the passenger cars, of which there had been 3. Then the cage car scatter, which was distinctive. She found, in a mounded heap, the twisted iron bar work of what had clearly been a cat cage, the bars still in the pattern of the cage door, and, 10 yards further south, a smaller cage with square mesh iron, which she and Kellen agreed had probably held one of the smaller animals a small Ozark circus of the 60s would have carried, a monkey or a caged bird or a fox. The cages were empty. Kellen said quietly, "In 1868 the animals would have been taken out first, either by the survivors or by the folks who came in for them the following spring. Vardy had a menagerie of only 3 or 4 bigger animals, a bear, 1 cat, some smaller stock. The bones would have been carried off long ago." She nodded. She kept walking. At the far south end of the wreck line, she found the manager's car. It was, as Kellen had said, pinned under a fallen oak. The tree had come down within the first 10 years of the wreck and had held the car against the ravine floor, and the second-growth timber had grown up around and over both, and the two of them had aged together into a shape a person would walk past without a second look, unless the person had been trained to see it. The car was a small wooden coach, about 18 feet long, with the roof partly collapsed, but the frame sound. The door on the ravine side had rotted off its hinges. Dosia looked in. In the round of her hooded lantern she saw, in the interior of the car, a small oak roll-top desk still upright against the far wall, and on the wall above the desk, a framed daguerreotype of a woman that had faded almost to white in 70 years of dim light. She stepped inside. She said, "Mr. Vardy, I am Dosia Fur, Coyle Fur's daughter. I have come to look at the desk." The roll-top of the desk had rotted to a soft gray shell, but the desk itself was sound. She lifted the shell of the roll-top off in one careful sheet. Inside the desk were 3 drawers on the right and a small cubbyhole array on the left, and, in the knee-hole, a cast-iron strongbox chained by a light iron chain to the desk's own back frame. The strongbox was small, the size of a shoebox, and had a hinged lid and a hasp and a small brass padlock the color of dried blood. She sat down on the floor of the car with her back against the desk and looked at the strongbox for a long moment. Whistle sat on the floor beside her. She cut the chain first. The chain had corroded almost through and gave under a light pull of the small axe. The strongbox came free. She lifted it out and set it on the desk. She wedged the brass switch key against the shackle of the padlock and struck the blunt end of the key with a river stone she had brought for the purpose. The shackle rang, once, a small clear ring in the quiet of the car. It did not give. She struck it again. Rang. Did not give. She struck it a third time, harder, and it broke, a clean break, and the two pieces fell against the desk with the small, dry sound corroded brass makes on old oak. She lifted the lid, coin, bank notes and coin together, in a canvas bag that had held the circus's take from the last town on the tour, sealed for the winter beneath the money, a folded oilcloth packet tied with a leather cord. She counted with her eyes. She would count with her hands later. She would learn the count came to something over $3,000 in 1860s banknotes and coin at face value, and something more at numismatic value once the State Museum took an interest, which it would. She did not think about the number in the car. She thought about the packet. She lifted it out. She untied the cord. Inside the packet were three things: a small ledger, the Vardy Grand Circus tour book for the season of 1868, in a neat pinched hand, a folded single sheet of foolscap headed Personal Testament, Emmett Vardy, Manager, Vardy Grand Circus, November 1868, and a single sealed letter addressed to Miss Prudence Vardy at Rolla, Missouri. She opened the letter. Emmett Vardy wrote to his sister Prudence that he was sorry. He said their father had, in 1848, left the small family show. 3 wagons and a bear and a monkey, and a mother and daughter aerial act. To Emmett alone, on the strength of the notion that a girl could not run a circus. Prudence had, at 19, run every rehearsal and every tent raising and every takedown of the show for 6 years. She had earned it. Their father had not seen it. When the father had died, Emmett had inherited the show and had grown it and had taken it over the years from 3 wagons to a small 9-car train and had traveled it every summer for 20 years. Prudence had married a Rolla schoolmaster in 1854 and had raised 3 children and had not, in 20 years, been to a show. Emmett had not, in 20 years, been to see her. He wrote he had told himself every winter that the next spring he would go up to Rolla for a week before the season started. He wrote he had never gone. He wrote, and Doshia would remember these lines the rest of her life, that a man who gives 20 years of a circus to strangers and does not give one afternoon back to his own sister is not, in the end, the man he had thought he was. He wrote that he was writing the letter because he could feel the trestle giving under the wheels, and he had already sealed the strongbox and had chained it, and he had a minute or two, while the crew was uncoupling the tender, to try to lighten the load, and if the letter reached Rolla, he would like Prudence to know that he had understood, on the trestle, what he had refused to understand every winter for 20 years, that the small hurt of her absence at the shows had been a small hurt she had absorbed for 2 decades, because she had loved him, and that the big hurt of his absence at her table had been her whole life, and that he was sorry. He asked her forgiveness. He said if she could not forgive him, he would understand. He signed his name. Under his name, in a smaller hand, Piccolina, I meant to. Every spring, I meant to, Piccolina. In the Italian. She had not known Emmett Vardy had been Italian. She looked up from the letter. She looked at the faded daguerreotype on the wall of the car and thought, with a small, quiet shock, that the woman in the picture, the woman she could just make out in the ghost of the image, had her mother's cheekbones, or something like them. Later, she would learn that Emmett Vardy's mother had been Emiliana Vardy, from a Sicilian family that had come out to St. Louis in the 20s, and that the family had shortened the name to Vardy in a Missouri courthouse in the 30s. Piccolina had been Emiliana's word for both her children. It had gone with them to circus posters and railroad wrecks, and had come, 70 years later, into the mouth of a Sicilian widow at a boarding house in West Plains, who did not know she was passing on a word Emmett Vardy had heard his own mother use. Dokia sat down on the floor of the manager's car with the letter in her lap. Whistle sat under her elbow. She copied the letter into her father's 12th notebook. in pencil, word for word. She refolded Emmett Vardy's original in the oilcloth. She whispered Prudence Vardy's name aloud. She did not know then whether the woman was living or dead. She would find out. They hauled the strongbox and the packet up out of the ravine on the following morning on a rope belay. It took the three of them the whole of the morning. They packed everything in oiled canvas at the rim and rode back into West Plains on the third afternoon. Dosia did not go to Mrs. Farrow's first. She went to the Frisco depot first, because Kellen said the Frisco should be told, as a matter of railroad courtesy, that the Elwood wreck had at last been walked. The depot agent looked at the muddy canvas on Dosia's saddle, and looked at Kellen, and looked at Emery Bledsoe, and did not say a word about picking over. He telegraphed the Frisco division office at Kansas City. He telegraphed the State Museum at Jefferson City. He offered Dosia coffee. She accepted. Prudence Vardy, they learned by inquiry to the Rolla County clerk, had died in 1910, aged 85, at the Rolla farmhouse where she had raised her children. She had said, until the day she died, that her brother Emmett had been a good man who had not written enough. She had left, however, 3 grandchildren, and one of them, a Miss Ann Vardy Coulter, aged 62, a piano teacher in Rolla, was still living. Dosia took the train up to Rolla in the second week of April, with the letter in her coat and whistle in a basket at her feet. Ann Coulter received her in a small parlor with a piano against the wall and a photograph on the mantel of a man in a straw hat and a white waistcoat whom Dosia recognized at once as the man who had written the letter. Dosia put the packet down between them. She said, "This was your great-uncle's. He wrote it to your grandmother. She never read it. I think perhaps you should." Ann Coulter read the letter. She read it a second time. She did not weep at first. She read it a third time. Then she did. She held Dosia's hand across the table a long minute and said, "My grandmother said all my childhood that Uncle Emmett had loved her and had not known how to write." She was right. I see. He had known. He had just not sat down until it was late. Dosia said, "The letter was written on the trestle. It could not have been later." Ann Coulter nodded and did not answer, and they drank tea. Dosia went back to West Plains by way of the Springfield lawyer's office. Wesley Ives, quiet and slow, took the false foreclosure paper apart in a Howell County courtroom over 90 days. On the strength of the minor signing defense, and on the strength of Coil Fur's Frisco personnel file, which Wesley subpoenaed, and which showed clearly that Reba Kern had never been named guardian of Dosia's estate. The 3 acres came back to Dosia, clear. Reba Kern left West Plains within the month. He was heard of, later, running a small hardware in Kabul. Dosia did not go looking. Vindication does not require a person to travel. She used the salvage money for 4 things. She bought back the 3 acres and rebuilt her father's small house on the lane. She commissioned a small granite stone for Emmett Vardy at the Rolla Cemetery, next to Prudence's stone, with the words "brother" below his name, in the small script Prudence had asked for on her own stone. She paid Kellen Stackhouse a partner's share for the rest of his working life, which turned out to be 9 years. She put the balance in a savings bank at Springfield and did not touch it except in November for the West Plains Schools Coat Fund. Whistle is buried at the fence corner nearest the tracks, where he liked to sit and watch the trains. There is a smooth flint pebble over him with his name scratched in with a nail. Mrs. Farrow died in 1942 at 86, in her own bed, with Dosia holding her hand, and her last word was Piccolina. Kellen Stackhouse died in 1947 at his pale yellow house, with Semaphore the terrier at his feet, in the same warm September light he had used to walk the Elwood Rim in 1918. Wesley Ives married a Springfield doctor and became county judge for Howell County. and remained Doshia's lawyer and friend until his own death in the 60s. Dokia did not marry. She was asked gently twice, and she said, of both of them, that she was grateful and unavailable, and she thought about it afterward, and not for long. She kept the brass switch key on her wrist the rest of her life. She kept the pet milk, evaporated milk can on the mantel, with a lock of Whistle's coat pressed into the lid. She kept the copy she had made of Emmett Vardy's letter in a drawer with her father's 12th notebook. She worked at the Willow Springs schoolhouse as a substitute teacher for 40 years and kept a small side business, writing rec reports for Frisco insurance investigators who preferred her to their own. Some things a person learns only from a ravine floor. Dosia learned, over the years, that Emmett Vardy had given 20 years of a circus to strangers and had not given one afternoon back to his own sister and had understood it on a trestle in the November of 1868 with the wheels beginning to lift. That her own father Coyle had walked the ravine in 1918 and had not gone into the manager's car because he wanted her to, and that a brass switch key was, in the right hands, not just a section hands tool, but a small key to a door 70 years old. The coin in the strongbox had bought back 3 acres and set a stone at Rolla and paid a partner. The letter had done more because the letter had put an Uncle Emmett who had loved his sister but had not written enough finally in possession of a way to say so. West Plains had said, the March Dosia Fur walked out to the Elwood Ravine with a rope belay and a folding spade, that 70 years was too many for a circus train to still be a circus train. The ravine had another opinion, so, in the end, did the manager's roll-top desk, which had waited on a piccolina all along. If you have ever meant to visit somebody every spring for 20 years and let every spring pass, drop a comment below and tell us the name. I read them all. See you in the next one.